A 13-year-old boy broke a lantern. That is all he did. He broke a lantern that belonged to a man with a badge, and for that, the town decided his life was over before it had truly begun. Everyone said he would be home by morning. He was not home by morning. He was not home by the following spring, or the spring after that, or the 10 springs after that. 60 years passed. An old man with white hair and a voice like dry leather stood in a prison yard and told a visiting governor 4 words that would break an entire territory's heart. I came here at 13. Nobody in that yard breathed. Not the guards. Not the hardened men who had killed and stolen and never once cried in front of another soul. This is the story of Jacob Carter, a boy who wanted nothing more than to sell firewood and grow up to own a ranch of his own, and the 60 years a lie in a lawman's mouth stole from him. It is a story about power without conscience, about a debt that took a lifetime to come due, and about the kind of forgiveness that costs more than any man expects to pay. Stay until the very end, and when you do, tell me in the comments what town or city you are watching from tonight. I would love to say hello and see just how far Jacob's story has traveled. Now let me take you back to where it all began. The autumn of 1866 settled over the town of Millbrook Flats the way it always did, slow and gold and smelling of cut hay. Out past the church and the feed store, where the road turned to little more than a wagon track, sat the Carter homestead, 40 acres of stubborn land that Samuel Carter had cleared with his own 2 hands the year his son was born. Jacob Carter was 13 that fall, all elbows and knees, with a mop of black hair that never sat right no matter how his mother combed it. He had his father's steady eyes and his mother's habit of humming while she worked, though most days it was Samuel's voice Jacob tried hardest to sound like when he spoke. A man's word is the only thing nobody can take from him unless he gives it away, Samuel liked to say, usually while splitting wood, the axe rising and falling in a rhythm Jacob had memorized before he could read. You remember that, son. Everything else can burn, get stolen, or blow away in a storm. Not your word. Jacob remembered it. He remembered it the way boys remember the things their fathers say only once but say with their whole chest. Money was thin at the Carter place, thinner than most folks in town realized, because Samuel never once complained about it in front of his neighbors. So 3 evenings a week, after his chores and after his lessons at the little schoolhouse behind the church, Jacob loaded a hand cart with split firewood and pulled it into town to sell, penny by penny, cord by cord, until his palms had gone hard with callus. He liked the walk into Millbrook Flats at dusk. He liked the way the lanterns came alive in the windows one by one, like the town was slowly waking up instead of going to sleep. He liked Mrs. Higgins at the general store, who always bought a bundle even when her own woodpile was full, just so Jacob wouldn't have to pull the cart back home. He liked dreaming, while he walked, about the ranch he would build someday, not a big one, not a rich one, just a place with a porch and a good well and cattle that knew the sound of his voice. Jacob's mother, Ruth, kept a small tin box on the kitchen shelf where every coin Jacob brought home went to be counted twice, once by her and once, secretly, by Jacob himself after she'd gone to bed, just to watch the little pile grow. She used to tease him about it. "You'll wear a hole clean through that tin, checking it every night," she said once, swatting his hand away from the shelf with a dish towel. "I'm only making sure nobody stole from us," Jacob said, grinning. "Nobody's going to steal from a house with a dog that barks at its own shadow," Ruth answered, nodding toward the porch, where the family's old hound had indeed just barked himself hoarse at a fence post. It was a small joke, the kind families keep for years without ever getting tired of it, and Jacob laughed every single time, because laughing with his mother in that warm kitchen was one of the few things in his young life that felt entirely safe. Samuel wasn't a hard man, not the way some ranch fathers were. He worked Jacob hard, but he worked beside him, shoulder to shoulder, and every evening when the light went gold over the fields, he'd stop whatever he was doing and simply look at the horizon for a moment, the way another man might pause to say a prayer. "What are you looking at, Pa?" Jacob asked him once. "Everything we haven't lost yet," Samuel said, and though Jacob didn't understand it then, he never forgot it either. He was a simple boy with a simple hope. And on an ordinary Tuesday evening in October, that hope walked straight into the one man in the territory who could crush it without even noticing he'd done it. Sheriff Ezekiel Grayson's wagon was the finest thing in Millbrook Flats, and everybody knew it, because Grayson made certain everybody knew it. Polished black wood, brass fittings that caught the sun like fire, and mounted on the side, a hand-blown glass lantern the sheriff had ordered special all the way from a catalog out of St. Louis. Jacob was hauling his cart around the corner by the livery when the wheel caught a rut. The cart lurched. A split log rolled loose, bounced once against the dirt, and cracked square into the side of that lantern. Glass rained onto the road. For one terrible second, Jacob simply stood there, staring at what he'd done, his stomach dropping the way it does when a boy realizes something cannot be undone. He did not run. His father's voice was louder in his head than his own fear. "I'll wait right here," Jacob said out loud to nobody, and he did. He stood beside that cart with his cap in his two hands, rehearsing an apology, while the sun sank lower and the shadows of the building stretched long across the road. When Sheriff Grayson came striding out of the saloon and saw the broken glass glittering at his feet, something moved behind his eyes that Jacob would spend 60 years trying to understand and never quite manage. "You did this." It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. It was an accident." "I'll pay for it, I swear it, I'll work it off, The back of Grayson's hand caught Jacob across the cheek before the boy finished the sentence. A crowd was gathering now, the way crowds do, drawn by nothing more than the smell of trouble. "Sheriff, he's just a boy," someone called from the boardwalk. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody ever does, not at first, not when the man doing the hurting wears a star on his chest. Grayson grabbed Jacob by the collar and hauled him down the road toward the jailhouse, boots dragging, cap forgotten in the dirt behind him. "You'll learn respect for a man's property," Grayson said, low, so only Jacob could hear it. "You'll learn it if it takes the rest of your fool life." Behind Jacob, Mrs. Higgins had come out onto the boardwalk of the general store, one hand pressed flat against her chest. She opened her mouth as if to call out, then closed it again, glancing toward Grayson's holstered pistol, and said nothing. Jacob would think of that moment often in the years that followed, not with anger toward her, but with a kind of aching understanding. Fear made quiet people out of good people. It was, perhaps, the saddest lesson the whole ordeal ever taught him. The jailhouse smelled of coal oil and old sweat. A single lantern. A plain tin one, nothing like the fancy glass one Jacob had broken, burned low on the sheriff's desk, throwing long shadows across the bars. Jacob sat on the cold floor because the cot felt like something he hadn't earned yet, some childish part of him still believing that if he simply behaved well enough, this would all be sorted out by morning. The cell door shut with a sound Jacob would hear in his sleep for 6 decades. Jacob sat on the edge of a cot too short for him and waited for his father. Samuel came the next morning, hat in hand, offering to pay for the lantern twice over, offering his labor, offering anything a poor honest rancher had to offer. Grayson refused to even open the office door all the way. The boy assaulted an officer of the law and destroyed county property, Grayson said through the gap. This isn't a matter for a firewood peddler to negotiate. He's 13 years old, Samuel said, and Jacob, listening through the bars, had never heard his father's voice crack like that before. Then he'll learn young, Grayson said, and shut the door. Days became weeks. Samuel rode to the county seat twice, asking after a trial date, a hearing, anything. Both times he was told the paperwork was being processed. Both times, nothing came of it. Weeks became months. Jacob was moved from the town jail to a holding cell at the territorial courthouse, then, when that filled, transferred again, a boy shuffled along a paper trail that nobody bothered to read closely, because the man who'd started that trail wore a badge, and badges, in that territory and in that year, were rarely questioned twice. Officials who might have asked a hard question chose instead to stamp the transfer forms and move on to the next stack on the desk. It was easier. It always is. Jacob wrote his parents letters that were never answered, though later, much later, he would learn the truth. His mother had written back every single time, and every single letter had been intercepted and burned by a clerk who owed Sheriff Grayson a favor. Samuel and his wife spent the rest of their lives believing their son had simply stopped writing, had perhaps grown ashamed, had perhaps died somewhere in a system too large to search. They went to their graves without ever learning he was still alive. There was one clerk, a nervous young man named Wallace who worked the transfer desk at the territorial courthouse, who noticed the missing trial record the very first week Jacob's file crossed his table. He even drafted a letter questioning it. But Wallace also had a wife expecting their first child and a job he could not afford to lose, and when his supervisor told him plainly that Sheriff Grayson's paperwork was not to be second-guessed by junior clerks, Wallace folded the letter into a drawer and never sent it. He would think of that folded letter for the rest of his life, long after he'd become an old man himself, and he would never quite forgive himself for the sending he didn't do. That was the quiet horror of it. Nobody had planned to destroy Jacob Carter's life. That was, in its own way, the cruelest part. It hadn't taken a grand conspiracy, a room full of villains plotting in the dark. It had only taken one proud man's temper, and 100 ordinary, frightened people deciding, one small decision at a time, that it wasn't their business to ask questions. Injustice rarely announces itself with a villain's laugh. More often it simply walks in through an open door nobody thought to close. Jacob, for his part, still believed for the first 2 years that it was all some enormous mistake that adults, being adults, would eventually untangle. He kept a mental list of everything he would say to his mother the day the cell door finally opened. By the 3rd year, the list had stopped growing. By the 5th, he had stopped rehearsing it altogether, though he never fully let it go, tucking it instead into some quiet corner of himself where hope could rest without being trampled every single day. By the time Jacob turned 20, he had been moved through 3 different territorial facilities and had long since stopped expecting a hearing. He learned, because a boy who wants to survive learns fast, how to work laundry lines until his hands cracked and bled, how to shoe a horse without losing a finger, how to swing a blacksmith's hammer so the sparks arced clean instead of biting his forearms. An older prisoner named Caleb Boone took the boy under his wing in those first hard years. Caleb had a gray beard, 3 missing teeth, and a rule he repeated so often Jacob could recite it in his sleep: "They can lock up your body, son. Don't you ever let them lock up who you are inside it." "How do I do that?" Jacob asked him once, "when nobody out there even remembers my name?" Caleb thought about it a long while before answering. "You remember it. That's enough for now. One day somebody else will too." There was a prison cook named Martha Ellis who slipped Jacob an extra biscuit more nights than she ever let on, who patched his shirts without being asked, who once sat with him in silence for an hour on the anniversary of his arrest without either of them saying a single word about why. Kindness, Jacob learned, didn't always come dressed as freedom. Sometimes it came as a warm biscuit and a woman who simply chose to see him as a person instead of a number. The years rolled on the way a wagon wheel rolls on a long flat road, slow, grinding, each turn looking exactly like the one before it. Jacob learned prison farming. He learned to grow calluses over old wounds, both the kind on his hands and the kind nobody could see. Younger inmates began arriving who called him Old Cowboy long before his hair had any right to be gray, simply because of the quiet, weathered way he carried himself. Most of them, when they heard his story in pieces over the years, didn't believe it. 60 days for a broken lantern, maybe, one young inmate said once, shaking his head. Nobody stays in for that. You must have done something else. Jacob stopped trying to convince people after a while. He simply worked, and waited, and kept his father's words folded up somewhere inside him where the years couldn't reach. A man's word is the only thing nobody can take from him unless he gives it away. Jacob never gave his away. He never once, in 60 years, told a lie about what had truly happened to him. There was drama enough in those years to fill a lifetime on its own. In his 30th year, a younger inmate named a man everyone simply called Redbone convinced 3 others to make a run at the outer fence during a summer storm, certain the noise of the thunder would cover them. Jacob was asked to join. He refused, not out of fear, but because Caleb Boone's old rule had settled so deep into him by then that it had become a kind of second conscience. A man doesn't trade the only thing he's got left, his good name, for one desperate roll of the dice. He was right to refuse. 2 of the 4 were shot before they cleared the fence line. Redbone lived, but spent the next 11 years in a stricter facility 200 miles east, and the guards afterward treated every remaining inmate with a suspicion that made daily life harder for months. Jacob never once said, "I told you so." He simply kept working the forge, kept his head down, and let time do what time does. Not every memory from those years was heavy. Caleb Boone, for all his hard rules, had a dry sense of humor that kept more than one prisoner from losing his mind entirely. He used to claim, with a perfectly straight face, that he'd once wrestled a mountain lion for a biscuit and lost the biscuit but kept his dignity, and he told the story so many times, with so many wild variations, that even the guards started placing quiet bets on which version they'd hear next. "Caleb, that cat gets bigger every time you tell it," Jacob said once, laughing despite himself over a bowl of thin prison stew. "Man's allowed to improve on the truth a little when the truth's the only entertainment he's got left," Caleb answered, entirely unbothered, and the whole table laughed until Martha Ellis had to come shush them from the kitchen window. Those small moments were what kept Jacob whole. He noticed, over the decades, that the men who survived prison with their spirit intact weren't always the toughest ones. They were the ones who still let themselves laugh at a story about a mountain lion, who still noticed the particular blue of a sky through a barred window, who still, in whatever small way was left to them, chose to live rather than simply endure. By his 40th year inside, Jacob had become something of a fixture. The quiet blacksmith everyone respected but few truly knew. New wardens came and went. New guards learned quickly not to bother the old cowboy, because he caused no trouble, worked harder than 3 men half his age, and carried himself with a dignity that made even hardened officers a little uneasy, the way a man feels uneasy standing too close to a church on a weekday. He thought of his parents every single day, though the thinking had changed shape over the years. From raw grief, to aching hope, to something quieter and sadder, a kind of steady grief he simply learned to carry the way he carried everything else. He pictured his mother's tin box on the kitchen shelf. He pictured his father watching the horizon at dusk. He never once let himself picture them as they might actually look now, old and gray and worn thin with waiting, because some part of him understood that if he pictured that too clearly, he might not find the strength to get up and work the forge the next morning. The territory had a new governor by then, a man named Thomas Whitmore, young for the office and known, unusually, for that era, for actually reading the reports his clerks handed him instead of simply signing them. Whitmore toured the territorial prison on a bright spring morning, shaking hands, asking questions the guards weren't used to fielding. He noticed an old man near the smithy, white-haired, straight-backed despite his years, working a piece of iron with hands that moved like he'd done it 10,000 times before. "How long have you been here, old-timer?" Whitmore asked, more out of habit than curiosity. Jacob set down his hammer. "Since I was 13, sir." Whitmore laughed, assuming he'd misheard. 13 years, you mean?" "No, sir." Jacob's voice was steady, the way it had always been steady, even when nothing else in his life was. "I was 13 years old when they brought me in. I am 73 now." The yard went silent in a way that yards full of hardened men almost never do. A guard near the fence stopped mid-sentence. 2 inmates who had murdered men without blinking found themselves wiping their eyes with the backs of their filthy sleeves, because there is something about an old man's quiet dignity that can crack open even the hardest hearts. "For what crime?" Whitmore asked, and his voice had lost its casual edge entirely. A broken lantern, sir. I never had a trial. I never had a hearing. I've been asking for one for 60 years. Whitmore looked at the old man for a long moment, and something in his face changed, the look of a man who has just realized the ground beneath his own office is not as solid as he believed. Nobody moves this man, Whitmore said to the warden. Nobody so much as touches his file until I have it in my own hands. Judge Nathaniel Brooks was given the file 3 days later, a folder so thin it should have embarrassed every clerk who'd ever stamped it. There was no trial record. There was no sentencing order. There was nothing but a single handwritten note from 60 years earlier: boy destroyed county property. Hold pending sheriff's decision. Pending. 60 years pending. Brooks worked through the night with 3 assistants, pulling old transfer logs, cross-referencing names, tracking down retired clerks who remembered pieces of a story nobody had wanted to remember whole. What they found, laid end to end, was almost too simple to believe: a boy jailed on the word of one angry man, and a paperwork trail that everyone downstream had simply chosen not to question, year after year after year, because it was easier not to. And there was one more discovery, the one that finally set the whole territory talking. Sheriff Ezekiel Grayson, the very man who had jailed a 13-year-old boy over a broken lantern, had gone on to become the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties. He had used his position and his connections to buy up failing homesteads for pennies, had eventually traded his badge for a judge's robes, and was now spoken of in Millbrook Flats as one of the most respected men the territory had ever produced. The very system that had erased Jacob Carter had spent 60 years polishing the reputation of the man who erased him. Among the retired clerks Judge Brooks tracked down was Wallace, now an old man himself, living quietly on a small pension 2 towns over. When Brooks asked him gently whether he remembered anything about a boy's file going missing, its trial record, Wallace's hands began to shake so badly he had to set down his coffee cup. "I drafted a letter," Wallace admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. 40 years ago. I never sent it. I told myself it wasn't my place." He looked up at Brooks with the kind of shame that doesn't fade with age, only settles deeper. "Is he still alive? The boy?" "He is," Brooks said. 73 years old, and asking the same question he asked at 13. Nobody's ever answered it. Wallace wept openly at his own kitchen table, and later, at his own insistence, gave a full sworn statement that became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Proof that the failure had never been Jacob's, and proof that at least one man had known, even briefly, that something was terribly wrong, and had been too frightened to say so. When the newspapers got hold of the full story, it spread across the territory faster than any wildfire. Strangers who had never met Jacob Carter found themselves crying over their morning coffee. Editorials asked the same question in a dozen different towns. How many other Jacobs had there been, quietly forgotten, while men like Grayson climbed higher on the backs of paperwork nobody dared to question? Reporters descended on Millbrook Flats within the week, and for the first time in 60 years, the name Jacob Carter was spoken aloud in the very streets where he had once pulled his firewood cart as a boy. Some of the old-timers who remembered him, or remembered hearing of him, wept openly on their porches. Others simply stood in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the respected Judge Grayson they had toasted at town suppers with the frightened, furious young sheriff who had once dragged a boy down Main Street by his collar. Governor Whitmore arranged the meeting himself, in a plain room at the courthouse, with nothing but a table and 2 chairs between the 2 men whose lives had been tangled together for 60 years by a single moment of temper. Grayson walked in first, 79 years old now, still broad through the shoulders, still carrying himself like a man used to being obeyed. He stopped the moment he saw the old prisoner sitting across the table, and something in his proud face simply collapsed. "Jacob," he said. It was barely a whisper. "You remember my name," Jacob said. "I'm surprised." Grayson's hands had begun to shake. He lowered himself slowly into the empty chair as though his legs no longer trusted him to stand. I told myself for years it wasn't as bad as I remembered. I told myself you'd have been let go eventually. I never checked. God help me, I never once checked. 60 years, Jacob said quietly. I'm not here for an apology, Sheriff. I stopped waiting on those a long time ago. Then why did you come? Because Governor Whitmore asked me to. And because a man ought to look another man in the eye at least once before one of them dies. Grayson's composure broke completely then. He slid out of the chair and onto his knees on the courthouse floor, an old man in a fine coat kneeling in front of an old man in prison gray. I have carried this every day, he said, his voice cracking apart. Every ranch I bought, every honor this territory ever gave me, I carried you underneath it like a stone in my boot. Can God forgive a man for what I did to you? Jacob looked down at him for a long moment. There was no triumph in his face, and no cruelty either. Only a tiredness that went bone deep. That's not a question for me to answer, Jacob said. That's between you and him. But I'll tell you what I've learned in 60 years of thinking about it. Forgiveness and consequences aren't the same thing. A man can be forgiven and still have to live with what he did. Both things are true at once. In the weeks that followed, Grayson tried everything a wealthy, guilty man knows how to try. He offered Jacob a working ranch, fully stocked, free and clear. He offered money enough to buy 3 ranches over. He offered horses, cattle, hired hands, a fine house in town, anything Jacob's 60 stolen years might be traded back for. Jacob turned down every offer, gently, without anger. You don't understand, Grayson said one afternoon, nearly desperate by then. Take the ranch. Take the money. Let me at least try to give something back. Jacob considered him for a long moment before he answered, and when he spoke, his voice was calm in a way that made the words land harder than any shout could have. You didn't steal a ranch from me, Sheriff. A ranch, I could rebuild. I've done harder things with less. What you stole was the only thing a man only gets to live once. My childhood. My mother and father's last 30 years of hoping. The chance to grow up ordinary, the way every other boy in Millbrook Flats got to. No amount of land can buy back a stolen life. It was never yours to sell back to me in the first place. He stood, settled his old hat on his head, and walked out of the room, leaving Grayson alone with everything he could never fix. Grayson wept there for a long time. Word later reached Jacob that the old judge signed over the bulk of his fortune to a fund for wrongly imprisoned men before he died 2 years later, not because it could undo what he'd done, but because, as he told Whitmore near the end, a man ought to at least try to leave the world a little more honest than he found it, even 60 years too late. Governor Whitmore granted Jacob Carter a full and formal pardon, the first the territory had ever issued for a case that old. The town of Millbrook Flats, ashamed and grateful in equal measure, built Jacob a small cabin on a quiet plot at the edge of town, with a porch that faced the sunrise and a well that never ran dry. He was 73 years old, and for the first time in 60 years, nobody was watching him, counting him, or deciding when he was allowed to go home. In the evenings, children from town began walking out to sit on Jacob's porch steps and listen to him talk. He told them about his father's axe and his mother's humming, about Caleb Boone's rule that nobody can lock up who you truly are, about Martha Ellis and her secret biscuits, about a boy who once dreamed of nothing grander than a porch and a good well and cattle that knew his voice. He never once told the story with bitterness. That, more than anything, was what the children remembered, and what they carried with them long after they'd grown and had children of their own. "Wasn't you angry your whole life?" one boy asked him once, sitting cross-legged on the porch boards. Jacob thought about it the way he thought about everything now, slowly, without rushing toward an easy answer. "I was angry a long time," he admitted. "Anger's a fair thing to feel when somebody steals from you. But I learned something out there that I want you to carry with you. A man can steal your years. He can steal your name, your freedom, even your family's last chance to say goodbye. But he can only steal your peace if you let him keep the key to it. I decided a long time ago I wasn't handing mine over twice. He found, too, a small measure of peace in an unexpected place. Wallace, the old clerk whose folded letter had haunted him for 40 years, wrote to Jacob asking for nothing but the chance to say he was sorry in person. Jacob invited him to the porch. The two old men sat together for an entire afternoon, saying very little, and when Wallace finally rose to leave, Jacob shook his hand and said only, "You told the truth when it mattered most, even if it came late. That counts for something. Most men never manage it at all." Wallace left Millbrook Flats that evening lighter than he had felt in 40 years. He died at 81, 8 peaceful years after his release, in the cabin the town had built him, with the sun coming through the window the way it always had at his father's homestead decades before. At his funeral, half the county turned out, including men and women who had once been children on his porch steps, now grown, now telling their own sons and daughters about the old cowboy who taught them that dignity was the one thing a jail cell could never truly hold. Millbrook Flats still remembers him. There's a small marker near the old courthouse today, plain and simple, the way Jacob would have wanted it. It doesn't mention Sheriff Grayson at all. It only says, Jacob Carter. He kept his word, even when the world broke its promise to him first. If this story moved you even a little, stay a moment longer and tell me in the comments what town or city you're watching from tonight. I'd love to say hello and see just how far Jacob's story has traveled by the time you read this.